welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. Welcome to our community chat. Joining me today are Carolyn Ferguson, an electrical engineer and a lecturer in the Electrical Engineering Department at the University of Technology here in Jamaica, and Kevon Swift, who is the Head Strategic Relations and Integration of the Latin America and Caribbean Network Information Center, LACNIC, which is the regional internet registry serving the Latin American and Caribbean regions. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
In this community chat, we'll be discussing two topics. First, digital switchover for Jamaica, which Carolyn tabled, and second, the state of internet governance initiatives across Latin America and the Caribbean, which Kevon submitted for discussion. All right, so we're going to start off with digital switchover for Jamaica, which speaks to replacing analog broadcast transmissions with digital transmissions. And it's a concept that has been discussed extensively in the Caribbean and certainly in Jamaica as well. However, Carolyn, why did you want us to discuss this topic?
Digital switchover has been looked at in our jurisdiction, meaning Jamaica, for a very long time. And there are many tiers or many levels that will be affected by this change. Service providers will have to change out their major equipment. For consumers, it will mean, in some cases, changing or acquiring new television sets. And in general, it also affects spectrum management, meaning you're able to release spectrum, and that can go to expanding mobile offerings, for example, and it is to give benefit in that regard. We've been talking about digital switchover for a number of years and need to come to a decision as a nation as to which standard is to be used, which date it is going to be implemented, and ultimately when we will switch off analog transmissions. So I wanted to bring it to the forefront as much as possible for persons to be aware and possibly join in the discussion, but understand that this is something that is coming. And so the idea is to educate persons further and to keep the discussions going.
Kevon, you have anything to add or to say before I jump in?
Not much. I will just simply say that it is quite refreshing to hear Jamaica's plans to conduct a digital switchover. I know, for instance, here in Trinidad and Tobago that there have been discussions about it, but on seeing Caroline's work and the milestones that are set, I think it could be one of the more exemplary experiences here in the Caribbean that others will be able to follow. And of course, this is indeed in keeping with what we can anticipate in terms of future business models for ICT players because of convergence, because of the evolution of the traditional telecoms model and what we are seeing now with models that are driven by data.
So, Carolyn, let me ask, because as much as I guess you are probably participating in some of the discussions, working with the university and certainly in your own capacity and industry experience in ICT and telecommunications, do you have a sense as to why it has taken so long for Jamaica to at least effect the switchover? I think I even heard that 2018 was going to be a date for the switchover to be implemented or concluded, and it now appears that there still hasn't been a date confirmed.
Right. So in my capacity, I was part of a forum because the CTO, the Caribbean Telecommunications Organization, has put together a forum bringing together all the industry players across the Caribbean to discuss this topic. And locally, in February 2018 to be specific, we held an information session here at the University of Technology. And in terms of what is happening with the technical committee, we do have a member of the IEEE. I'm also a member of IEEE as an expert contributing to that. To be honest, the Broadcast Commission, just to put this in context, the Jamaica Broadcasting Commission are the regulating body charged with the whole process of driving this, giving technical advice to Parliament and most importantly, selecting one of two primary standards for digital broadcasting, which is called DVB T2 and ATSC 3.0. There are pros and cons that providers would want to choose either of these standards, and a consensus has to be made as to which one it's going to be. I do believe that is one of the points that have been taking a while, as there are contending reasons, and if there doesn't seem to be the ability to get to just deciding one. And so, it's like an equal toss between selecting one or the other standard. If there's a role that Parliament has to play in deciding on a date, so I'm not aware if it is a case where they just have not had the opportunity to talk fulsome about it. But I just believe it's just the whole regulatory machinery taking longer than intended, really. And so the last date, using, taking information from the Broadcasting Commission, as, they have extensive information and a roadmap is there. We're still at the point of deciding which standard will be used and deciding on a date when we will switch over to digital.
Let's say for new licensees, broadcast licensees, are they currently allowed to implement analog transmissions, or is it just primarily digital?
The Spectrum Management Authority would issue licenses.
Right.
Now, on a point of information, we do have a company called Ready TV. They are a wireless cable provider. They are free-to-air broadcasters.
Okay.
They have been given a license to transmit, and they, based on their own business model, are transmitting fully digital, and they are using one of the two standards that as a country we have to decide to use, and they are currently using DVB T2.
Okay.
So they have more recently come into the market, have been given a license, and have gone ahead to digital transmission, selecting one of the standards.
Okay.
While Jamaica as a country has not made it official what the standard will be and even when we will have the full switchover.
Okay.
So, Carolyn, given that Ready TV has really taken the front, so they're not relying on the regulation to implement a new model, and they have chosen DVB-T2, wouldn't that set a precedent somewhat? What are some of the considerations for determining which would be the model to apply nationally? What are some of the inner workings of that?
The forum that was held, organized by the CTO in November 2017, did involve the Broadcasting Commission, Ready TV, and a number of persons from the Caribbean. And that point did come up. Now that there is one operator transmitting on a particular standard, does it then force the hand, so to speak? And there was no clear, and I'm saying that with a smile, there's no clear indication that they're like, yeah, so, we have to do this. So for me, I think the jury is still out. Two of the main considerations that have come from our primary providers, or two main free-to-air broadcasters, are TVJ and CVM. They consider, when they make their presentations, they consider things such as availability of equipment, as well as internationally, which is being used more. ATSC 3.0 is primarily an American standard, to put it loosely, while DVB T2 is a European standard. So it means that equipment and so on will come from one area of the world versus the other. However, it is true that even in Jamaica, cable broadcasters using cable to connect to their customers are using DVB T2. So while we have wired transmission in Jamaica, wired transmission uses the DVB T2. The ATSC 3.0, there's interoperability that has to be considered. But what we learned in the presentation last November is that the 3.0 version of ATSC is pretty close to the DVB T2 now, as in fact they revised the standard, and so there's better interoperability. So I think that the considerations that were possibly there, say a few years ago, may be a little different now, and possibly we could say hopefully lead to the country making a decision sooner than later.
So let me just turn this question around, at least our discussion around a bit, because from the information that was available, I noted that the whole issue of the digital switchover, at least here in Jamaica, was first mooted in 2003. So it's a good 15 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering
Indeed.
whether or not the reason why we haven't had much movement on this whole thing is because there really has not been a pain point that needed to be relieved. And whether, for example, we are getting all bogged down in the technical issues, but the whole policy imperative or the policy and regulatory imperative has not necessarily been strong enough to cause the move. What are your thoughts, Kevon and Carolyn?
I could take that point because one of the things that you consider, once a decision is made as to which standard you'll be using and when you'll switch over, then there's the whole matter of educating the general public. You also have to consider your vulnerable groups in terms of having them not being disenfranchised with the analog being switched off, and then suddenly they're not getting to see what they usually watch. And in other jurisdictions who have done this, there's the whole matter of a subsidy. In some countries, they use subsidies or coupons to encourage the population to take on the digital TV transmissions. And so that, as subtle as it is an addition, is a cost for persons or something they have to do, and you're telling them we're switching from digital to analog, and so you're basically forcing, so to speak, you're forcing this on the population, and so it forces a cost. And that is something that has to be planned when you decide to do switchover as one of the things. Of course, public education, again, costs. There'll be costs for the operators to switch to new equipment, television. So you have that cost factor on the consumer side. And of course, there's always an opportunity on the business side. Kevon, you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, just one brief thought, and this is really piggybacking on that comment you made and Michelle's question too. The technological imperative is there, and I think a lot of your discussions have focused on the technological imperative, but probably the hesitation or the delays in seeing some sort of firm commitment to the transition would lead to the economic imperatives, because as you had mentioned, with DVB-T2 being a European standard, whereas ATSC being the American one, you could equally understand that the costs, as you had mentioned a number of times, would be one of the main concerns for operators. But in general, I think one of the issues that we see, and this isn't just Jamaica, this is across the board, is that the level of innovation that you see among service providers may not be very high if competition in the telecom space isn't extremely developed. So I think it's still a question of operators being at that point in determining what will be the future models or the future types of services that they're going to offer. And I think the demand that will stimulate that, the demand from other content providers, from other actors within the data value chain, I think that demand is still required to be stimulated a bit. And that may help cement the policy basis that will be required to effectively give guidance to the transition.
Well, yes, and Kevon, you raise a good point, and Carolyn, you had mentioned it before. Like, for example, in the TV broadcast space, there are primarily two main providers, TVGen and CVM. Do you have a sense as to, with these two major players, there can be almost, I almost want to say like some sort of capture of the market? They are so powerful within the space that if they probably don't appear to be amenable, then things are not going to happen, as opposed to probably when one looks at the history of the telecom liberalization experience across the region, where the incumbent certainly was not happy with the change that was being effected, but it was done anyway. Whether or not there may be a little bit of a hesitation on the part of the policymakers and the regulators to implement what could be a very drastic transition, especially based on the constituents of the current market.
Yes, and to go back to one of the benefits of digital switchover is that, it should definitely create opportunities and bring more players into the market. On the matter of our two major free-to-air broadcasters, it's known in the public space that they actually prefer two different standards, one leaning more towards ATSC 3.0, the other DVB-T2. So, that really, as you're saying, is possibly causing some of the delay. Like, how do you then, what do you use after that to select a standard? So the difference is now, as I said, perhaps from 2002 compared to now, hopefully the considerations will be different, because while I'm not trying to use this podcast to push one standard versus the other, but it indicates some facts, DVB-T2 is widely used, not just in wireless transmission, but in cable transmission, and being used so done now in Jamaica. Equipment for DVB-T2 is actually produced in the United States, so there is that availability. It's there. So those considerations that I can think of are notable. Okay. So I think the toss between the two major providers, well, I guess we'll have to leave the regulators and the Parliament to come to a wise decision after that.
Kevon, you have any final questions? I have one more and then probably we'll wrap up.
Thanks, Michelle. Not a final question per se. I think, as I mentioned before, I think Jamaica's experience seemed to be, it's a commendable step already in terms of what had been organized. And I think a lot of it had stemmed from that forum organized by the Caribbean Telecommunications Union. I could just simply say that I look forward to seeing how the issue evolves, and I think that it would definitely give some substance into similar debates that other Caribbean countries will be facing by, with Jamaica taking the lead on something. I think it's very important that this sort of discussion is happening now. It started since 2002, and it's something that we will have to reckon with if we look at global trends and what is happening in terms of the evolution of TV services and information services.
And on that point, because that was kind of where I wanted to just have a sync as we conclude, is when we look at trends in terms of viewership and listenership, is TV broadcast and free-to-air TV broadcast really going to be as important as it has been in the past? Going forward, viewership tends to be a bit lower than what it used to be. We are now getting a lot of information online and via streaming services. And probably, for many of us, the only time when you really think about TV broadcast or radio is, at times a disaster, making sure that you may have a transistor radio and so on to be able to get the latest news and to keep in touch, etc. So I'm just even wondering whether or not, 10 years from now, this whole debate and discussion may have concluded itself in a way that maybe we may not have expected.
Yes, that's actually a very good point. I just want to make a point of correction that the CTO is the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization. And you are correct. I mean, a lot of people are consuming their content online. They have WhatsApp groups. A lot of videos are shared there, Facebook, Twitter, all the more popular social media platforms. And so the free-to-air broadcasting may, as you said, as a technology, people might just naturally, there may just be a natural attrition from it. And I suppose that in Jamaica, we do still have, based on my understanding, this could change hopefully over time, but there are still areas that are underserved. But again, it is notable that over time, digital, maybe in Jamaica, because quite frankly, a lot of countries in the world have moved to digital transmission. And so it's there. It just might serve another purpose or be used in other ways than simply free-to-air broadcasting. Because what digital switchover does as well, which I probably failed to mention, is that it provides additional services. So you can have pay-as-you-go services, you can have subscription services, and so you can enhance your offering with digital transmission. So while you may not have the same free-to-air tuning in and watching whatever is being shown, the digital switchover will do is allow more on-demand and more maybe pay-as-you-go services, so to speak. So there's that opportunity as well.
Okay, excellent. So we'll end it there. And I guess if any of you who are listening want to ask questions or want to make a point or leave us a comment, you can do so on the ICT Pulse website or in any of our social media accounts. So going on to our second topic, and this is the last topic, is the state of internet governance initiatives across Latin America and the Caribbean. So Kevon, you're up to bat. And, for those who, regularly access ICT Pulse, you know that we discuss internet governance related issues quite regularly. I mean, most recently we interviewed Albert Daniels of ICANN for this podcast. And further, I think that generally there has been a common lament in several quarters that the Caribbean is not as involved in internet governance issues as it should be. So, Kevon, why did you want to discuss the state of internet governance initiatives? Has anything changed?
Thank you very much, Michelle. The real reason why I wanted to discuss this topic is because I think we're at a critical juncture in terms of the Caribbean, where the national internet governance initiatives are really required for us to get more of the outcomes that we want to see in the digital policy space on a national level. And it's interesting because in terms of regional internet governance initiatives, the Caribbean was at the forefront. So even before the second phase of the World Summit on the Information Society, which was the international convening of how we treat the future of ICTs and where the terminology internet governance came from. We had the very first regional IG process that had ever been conducted, being undertaken in September 2005 by the CTU, the Caribbean Telecommunications Union. So the Caribbean has been somewhat of a pioneer in some of the approaches that are required for this digital space. And the approach in particular that I will discuss further is the multi-stakeholder approach, where traditionally any sort of policy-making activity would have possibly been a closed-door activity, but when it comes to digital, there's an understanding that there are multiple players and actors involved. The sources of information lie in different parts of this ecosystem of a network, what we will call networked governance. And in order to really come up with effective solutions for the development of our internet and our digital experience, we need to rely on this multi-stakeholder model. So the national and regional initiatives, we will just loosely call them NRIs, which is an acronym that is in use in the international community. They stand for National Regional IGF Initiatives. But I wanted to just make a small distinction in saying that I would like to refer to these as National Regional IG Initiatives, because we see that there are two orientations that happen for these NRIs. On the first front, we have NRIs that have been created to focus on how a national community can participate in the Global Internet Governance Forum. And on a second front, you see NRIs that actually just focus on national issues and focus on how to improve internet development on a local front. There are a couple of challenges to these initiatives as they're convened. I'll just mention three of them. One of these challenges, or the first I would say, is the possibility of groupthink, or where we have elitization of the organizers of a national initiative. So it's internet insiders, people who are already in the know, and their ideas tend to dominate what the forum discusses. And as a result, instead of this being an open initiative for an open community, it becomes rather closed. Another challenge deals with institutionalization, or too much institutionalization, to the extent that there isn't enough flexibility for these discussions to occur, as would be required for any instance of digital policy. So instead of saying that we are treating this as policy as discourse, if you tend to make it too rigid, you will be actually defeating the purpose of convening a forum to formulate and shape digital policy. And the third challenge I want to mention deals with financing and sustainability, which is a perennial challenge that a lot of initiatives face. because on the one hand, different to other ICT events, it's not necessarily a question of having tickets available and high-level sponsorships for commercial returns. One of the difficulties in this space is that when it comes to monies, the donors have to really treat them as donations and not sponsorships per se. I mean, they can sponsor, but without that anticipation for some sort of commercial feedback, brand recognition, and the like. And we have seen, for instance, with the LAC IGF, which is the regional IG process for Latin America and the Caribbean, they have managed to get private sector entities on board to actually pool monies into a fund, which helps substantiate the cost of convening an annual IGF space.
Okay. Carolyn, I'll let you jump in first. I have a couple of questions, but go ahead.
I was just wondering if, Kevon could help me here. I see where the whole matter of internet governance seem to cover a number of areas. Within the Caribbean, which group, or would it be a government regulator or would it be industry-related companies coming together to drive this? Would it be driven from the government, for example, top going down? Or is it that bankers, for example, will have to decide how they manage internet governance issues, or would they be the ones to create initiatives, or would they be led by initiatives created, say, again, by government? Is that how the Caribbean would need to follow through on these matters?
Thanks, Carolyn. That is a very, very important and relevant question, because the studies have shown that in the most instances where typically government is a large player within the economies, initiatives are set with a huge government trust. But at the end of the day, if stakeholders do not feel as if the space in itself is equitable, that it allows equitable participation, the possibility for their voices to be heard, then the initiatives tend to suffer in terms of the success factors behind the initiatives. It tends to suffer in terms of subsequent participation. It tends to suffer in terms of the attention that is given to the space. Another study that informs this conversation comes from the Global Information Society Watch. They had a 2017 report on NRIs, and they had actually mentioned that there are 3 preconditions that will determine what a successful IG initiative would need. And the preconditions deal with social contract. So that understanding of actors and various actors that they need to work together towards a workable solution. The understanding of agency, actors understanding their responsibility to act, and also the whole exercise of democracy within a territory. In terms of the Caribbean, I would say that so far, I want to make reference to 2 initiatives I had participated in personally. That's the IGF of Trinidad and Tobago and the IGF of Barbados. I would say that these 2 initiatives, which are quite embryonic, meaning only 1 to 2 instances have occurred, they have started off on the right path in ensuring that it is not necessarily a government-led initiative. It's an initiative that has multiple actors from various sectors, and even a level of diversity that is included that goes beyond just the actor dynamic. The diversity I'm referring to, for instance, would be the participation of women, female professionals, people with disabilities. I know in particular in the case of the Barbados IGF, there were a number of panels that dealt with gender issues online, gender safety, activism online. And I think these things are very important because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that IG doesn't seem to be a niche area with only a selected few in the know. Internet governance is something that affects all of us, and especially when we consider the digitization of our societies, what we will see is that it's not just the insiders, the people in the know who should be concerned, it's the people who are not in the know, those who are not connected as yet, those who are in a completely different field who may not think that IG is relevant to them, your trade professionals, your intellectual property professionals. I think it's important to understand that that diversity is also required when addressing or dealing with internet governance.
So, Kevon, just going back to actually the two examples you gave in terms of countries that have national IGF initiatives and programs, did you find in terms of, I guess, based on your first-hand experience and observations, in terms of the trend in the content and the thrust, were they focused on looking at internet governance issues for a national agenda or for just national discussion among the stakeholders, or were they more looking to inform their position on the global stage?
So with the two examples I had given, which would be the Barbados IGF and the Trinidad and Tobago IGF, I think they were both working towards doing general awareness raising and capacity building in internet governance. I think that was the initial premise of both of them. But I would say that it may be possible that one of the initiatives dealt much more closely with national issues and national obstacles that they have to internet development. Now, it's important to note that there isn't one approach that is better than the other, because even looking or talking about the international issues, we have to realize that if we are concerned about how internet develops, we can't just look at it from national borders. The internet is transnational, it's in a network space. So it's equally important to understand developments for domain name policy and developments that are happening on the telecommunications front in order to ensure that the national internet experience is developing how it should be. So the difference, I would say, is it all boils down to the strength of agenda setting. It's very important that when a national initiative sets its agenda, that agenda in itself is somewhat diverse. It does take the inputs from various parts of the community. And then, unfortunately, there's a trade-off game. There's a trade-off game because you may have an instance of an internet community providing a number of themes that they would like to address, but you have a physical limitation in terms of space and time. So how do you address these multiple themes, and how do you address them appropriately? So that's where I would say one of the things that is important for us in the Caribbean to understand is that while we may have this face-to-face physical event, how we get around the trade-offs is by working on things intercessionally. So the instance where you may have 10 pressing concerns ranging from human rights to accessibility to the like, it's important to be able to choose, and this choice should be done preferably by a multi-stakeholder committee, to choose what could be the top 3 to 4 issues to be discussed. And it's important to aerate and fully discuss those issues to the greatest extent while in the physical space. That doesn't mean that you don't address the other issues or you delay them till the next year, because of course things are moving so fast. I think what is required therefore is that after that physical space, a lot of work needs to happen in terms of engagement between sessions. So that's just a point of advice I wanted to put on that. In terms of the national focus versus an international focus, they're both equally important. And of course, one of the concerns that is arising across the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, is what impact do IG initiatives have on policy making? So it's all well and good to say that we are raising awareness and building capacity. And we should understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all across the region. The region has different states or different levels of maturity of internet governance initiatives. And when I say region, for instance, in Latin America and the Caribbean, Brazil has over 7 national IGFs. We have some mid-level communities such as the Dominican Republic, Paraguay, and Colombia with having 4 to 5. And now we have this new phase, which really kicked off since 2014 with the Snowden revelations and these concerns about mass surveillance and how personal data is addressed. So that really gave an impetus to seeing these new initiatives from 2014 onwards, where we have countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They're the ones within the Caribbean region that are really taking off. And we are hearing of discussions of an IGF coming soon in Belize and Guyana. So the recognition or the importance of them are there, but the question as to how they impact policy development on a real level, I think that's something that is critical. And seeing that we are starting at this point in the Caribbean, we need to include that in the design. And by including it in the design, what I'm saying is that it isn't for a government authority to appropriate the national IGF solely for policy making, because then we will exclude people, we will lose interest if we just go along the governmental policy authorities' objectives. But it's important for governments to recognize the importance and the value of these national IG spaces, to recognize who are the key players involved in the national internet communities, and then to be able to leverage those experiences or have something parallel that can work towards robust policy making.
Excellent. Carolyn, do you have any points before we move towards wrapping up?
Okay. Because the internet is this wide space, almost borderless, and I know that the internet governance, whatever initiatives fall within a country, has national and international considerations. I'm thinking to myself, are there challenges in developing policies where you would want to control something that is outside of your actual control because of just the way the internet is? And if you talk about privacy policies, let us say have Instagram, and your information and everybody in the country has information on Instagram. We talk about the internet forgetting, or people wanting to delete or not having their information stolen and shared. I'm wondering, is there a great big challenge in developing a policy when, Instagram is a company that's not, let's say for Jamaica, it's not a Jamaican company, it's not a Barbadian company, it's not a Trinidadian company. How does having internet governance initiatives affect something like that when you have to deal with a Facebook or, even Skype or LinkedIn, other, popularly used internet services that are just not within a particular country who would want to develop a policy around them? Or is that question within a context that suits this?
Yes, Carolyn, you said the magic word there that actually brought a smile to my face, and that word is control. As an internet governance professional, I think one of the key learnings, I would say, from any internet governance experience is that the main purpose is to avoid specifically that the idea that policy and regulation in the internet space is about control or centralization. One of the challenges I think we have in the Caribbean is that we think that we are not doing enough, we're not working fast enough to develop our ICT agendas. But what we may not recognize is that no country is able to develop policies, laws, and regulations fast enough to keep up with the rate at which technological innovation is happening. So in terms of the actors that are not within our jurisdiction, I think one of the key endeavors that initiatives need to include is the ideas of how do we coordinate with other actors? How do we coordinate? How do we understand multiple layers of governance that go beyond just national laws and national regulations? And I'll give you a very clear example. When it comes to the protection of personal data, there are some countries that do not even have fully proclaimed data protection laws. But you would see that by token of a private entity, and in this case, let's talk about telecom operators, through inspiration of their head offices, which may be outside of our jurisdiction, they would actually practice legal prudence in setting specific standards for processing and addressing personal data. And how that's enforced through the contracts that they have with customers. So on an issue like data protection, where a country may not have a law in place, this practice of private ordering from an entity that may not be bound to those practices of the national country in the absence of a law. They will be bound to company law, yes, but in the absence of a law that speaks to data protection, they have no obligation to it. They could take the onus from what is global best practice and actually institute things that will be of benefit to the local community. So it's a really big change of mindset, because I think one of the things, or one of the approaches we may think, is that we need to be in control of things. But I think the internet space and digital policy is where policymakers have to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. So the shift of paradigm is no longer a question of control, but rather a question of coordination, understanding where each actor and element lies, what each actor's and element's processes may involve, and how do we therefore effectively mix the trends or the endeavors of these different actors to ensure that a national community gets the best out of their internet experience. It's an interesting take, because no other policy area, no other issue area has undergone this level of transformation as compared to digital and internet policy issues. So it's a new practice for all of us, not only in the Caribbean, worldwide. And it's something that I think has moved off from being experimental and niche, which were the early days of the internet, to something which is getting greater political and policy considerations, both at international and national levels.
So, Kevon, just my last question, and I think we probably need to wrap up soon thereafter. Granted that I guess we have just a few Caribbean countries that have already had national IGFs, and a few that perhaps hopefully will be coming on stream relatively soon. What would you advise a country, what would you recommend a country to consider when they want to start their whole national IGF thrust?
Thanks, Michelle. The first lesson I would say is that you need to involve as many people as possible. So yes, in the Caribbean, we have movers and shakers, and they tend to be governmental state entities. But there needs to be a concerted effort to go beyond those movers and shakers when it comes to the organizing of these initiatives. So the organizing of the national IGF should include at least some civil society component and at least some other private sector component or the like. That has to be integral in the design in order for it to work. If not, it's a trust issue. You have a breakdown of trust from your national community if it's seen as something that's one-sided or slanted. The second point I would say is that the agenda doesn't need to be complicated. It could be very basic. Choose the top 2 pressing issues that your community faces and address those issues fully in a multi-stakeholder setting. And those issues could be, for instance, the cost of broadband, how personal data is processed, whether political parties have access to my personal data. Just choose 2 or 3 of those issues and address them succinctly. The third thing I would say for the Caribbean is that anticipate what your outcomes or your outputs from a national IGF would be. And when I say so, we are not the case of Brazil that started back in 2010, 2011. We are coming on board at a later stage. And I think it's important that we put in the design some of the outcomes and outputs from our processes. For the most part, past initiatives tended just to do a recording of their national IGF and paper report. And for instance, if they want to be recognized by the Internet Governance Forum Support Association, they need to submit this recording and this report. I would say go beyond that, because a recording or report may not be consumable for all stakeholder types. If you feel that in your national IGF there isn't a strong enough government presence, work with someone who may not be the high-level decision maker, but someone else within the government stakeholder to come up with an output that can be used and consumed by government, by permanent secretaries or CEOs and ministers, and ensure that there is something for everyone out of that space, and there is some sort of follow-up action intersessionally, meaning after the physical event is done, what happens in the lead up to the next event.
Excellent. Yeah, because that whole issue about the outcomes, and I think that in the region, just based on my limited observation, is that these meetings can easily just become some sort of talk shop. And I think that also affects the interest and participation subsequently, where there are not any fixed outcomes or desired outcomes or outputs that can help to seed the discussion continuing and then perhaps take you all the way up to the next meeting.
Yes, and that point is very important because within Latin America, there have been a few initiatives started just a few years ago from 2015 and so. And what has happened now in 2017, 2018 is that the level of participation has dropped significantly. And it's all because they haven't looked at the outcomes, and the issues seem to just reflect very niche concerns and very limited concerns. It's that difficulty of having a diverse community understand the relevance of internet governance. So I would say for the Caribbean, work on that from the onset, work on that from the design, and ensure that that is one of the things when you have your checklist, that you have outcomes and outputs in mind.
Oh, excellent. So, Carolyn, we're wrapping up now. So, any final thoughts?
Again, the whole matter, everything is, we're going to such a digital world that we have to look at all of these. And I note Kevon's suggestions at the end as to how a jurisdiction, a country can attack, for example, internet governance. And the word to me is just to keep it simple. And then on the matter of digital switchover, I'm hoping that maybe in another 2 or 3 episodes, I can come back to your podcast and we're talking about the standard that has been chosen and just how we're going to roll it out. So I'm looking forward to that for our country at least.
So, Kevon, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Thanks, Michelle. Similar to Carolyn, I'm hoping to have the possibility to come back to your podcast and speak about that shining example in the Caribbean where there's an effective internet governance forum where the understanding of digital development and transformation is cemented, and we have some significant achievements that marry the two. So for the most part, IG or national IG initiatives do not have indicators as such, meaning that there isn't a correlation or direct correlation between national IG spaces and digital development. But it's something that we can probably work towards and be innovative in the Caribbean and say, well, given our national IGF, given our experience, we have been able to achieve and list 2 or 3 achievements that are directly linked to the national IGF.
Okay, great. So thank you both for coming on, Carolyn and Kevon. I think that we've had quite an interesting discussion. The digital switchover, boy, Carolyn, I'm not sure whether or not you're going to be able to come back to discuss that issue in the foreseeable future, because I'm not sure whether or not the actual imperative, the thing that is really going to drive us through the discomfort and have us to really try to get a date, and then we'll work through all of the issues. I don't know if we're going to get to that point anytime soon. With the national IGFs and IGFs generally, I guess more Caribbean countries probably are definitely going to have them, because I think it's just so important, even at the national level, at the country level, for there to be discussion about issues, internet governance related issues, and how they affect the country, the citizens, the various stakeholder groups. And outside of important capacity building element, I think also being able to shape national policies. Whether or not it gets rolled up into the global conversation, I guess I can't say, but just certainly for us to become a little bit more aware and more involved at the country level, I think is so important. So thank you both again for joining us for this episode of the Community Chat, and I wish you all the best.
And thank you for having us.
Yes, thanks very much.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICT Pulse, or via Twitter @ICT Pulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.